Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to this comparison video for the new vintage graphic EQ in Logic 10.4 and the Waves API-560 plugin. Now, both of these plugins are modeled after the API-560, which was a hardware EQ unit that came out in the late 60s. What we're going to be doing today is basically just doing a shootout between these two to compare and contrast the differences and the similarities. Obviously, the first similarities, they're modeled after the same hardware unit. However, as I've started to use them, I've really noticed that there's a lot of differences, more differences than I thought. I really thought in this video that I would just do a traditional shootout and we would hear not that much of a difference between the two, but I've actually found that the difference between the two is quite drastic. So let's start with some drums. These are just the drums dry as is. And this is with the vintage graphic EQ kicked in. Now, when I go back and forth between these, I'm actually using Logic's bypass buttons, because if I use the in buttons, this also this doesn't include the volume reduction at the output of each plugin. And the reason why I have some volume reduction on each of these is to match the input and output signals loudness as well as I can. People always complain about examples being just louder, so I don't want that to be the case here. I want you to actually hear the frequency changes and the differences in the frequency spectrum of the before and the after. So what I'm going to do, and what I have done already in advance, is I've matched all of the band's gain. So for instance, on my 16K band here, I have 4.4 dB of boost. Over on the API 560 over here, I have the same thing, 4.4. So you'd think that these would sound very similar, but in fact they don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the original, then I'm going to kick in and kick out the vintage graphic EQ a couple times, then kick in the Waves 560 a couple times so you can hear the difference. So yeah, the first thing I'm noticing is that the vintage graphic EQ is much brighter. And one of the things I found when comparing the two was that I don't think that the faders on the vintage graphic EQ are scaled the same way as the Waves counterpart. Because as you can see here, this is 4.4 dB of gain. You would think that it would sound the same. The fader actually looks like it's in a different position here too. It looks like it's below the midway point. Over here, this is at 4.4, and it's actually above the midway point. So I feel like the vintage graphic EQ is scaled more logarithmically, because a boost of only, say, 3 or 4 dB actually sounds like more than 3 or 4 dB. Whereas with the API 560 from Waves, it's linearly. It kind of doesn't make any sense to me, though, because the value says 4.4 dB of boost. Over here, it says 4.4 dB of boost, but it obviously doesn't sound the same. And it's a pretty huge difference too, especially when you don't kick in the volume reduction that I added to keep the overall volume roughly the same. So I find that interesting. It doesn't mean that I like one or the other more or less. It just means that with the graphic EQ, you have to be a little more careful about your gain adjustments, whereas the Waves plugin, it tends to be a little more subtle. There are some cool advantages to the graphic EQ, though. One, you can actually tune up or down your bands by plus or minus 12 semitones, so up or down by an octave. So that's pretty cool. So you can actually find a different frequency center for each one of these bands that might sound better than just the fixed band going up each octave, as you normally see on the API 560. So that's actually not something that the hardware unit has either, and that's not something that the Waves unit has. You can also add a certain amount of saturation or output drive, and this saturation is based on the output model that you choose. The output models that you see are based on the vintage EQ collection that was added in Logic 10.4. So the Silky is the Neve, The punchy is the API, the vintage graphic, and the smooth was the Pultec. Of course, in Logic, they're not called that. In Logic, they're called the vintage console EQ, which is the Neve, vintage graphic EQ, which is the API, and the tube is the Pultec. So that's where those output models come from. So that's actually kind of cool that you can choose a different output stage of a different EQ and pair it with the actual EQ stage. Another cool thing here is you can choose between natural and linear phase. So in previous videos, I've explained what linear phase EQs are, and they essentially minimize the phase between bands, causing less coloration. Natural is just a regular old non-linear phase EQ, so you're going to hear all of those natural phase interactions and cancellations and additions that come with working with an EQ that's not linear phase. So what this does do, if you put this on linear phase mode, is it kind of makes any of these three EQs suitable for mastering. Because really, the only time I really use linear phase EQ is on buses or when I'm mastering. So that's really cool. All right, so let's try this out on guitar now. I'll do the same thing. I'll play just the regular old dry guitar signal. Then I'll kick in the Logic plugin, and then I'll switch over to the Waves plugin and go back and forth so you can hear the two. So I'm hearing they're pretty similar here. They're more similar here than on the drums because there's less high frequency content. That's really where I was hearing most of the boost, sort of almost an over boost using the graphic EQ was in the high end. Same as before, I've matched up all the levels. They're all identical in terms of the actual amount of dB of boost or cut. And here it's very similar. I could go either or. They both sound good to me. So one thing I do want to mention here that just more clearly demonstrates what I was talking about before, where you have more of a boost with the Logic EQ and less of a boost and more of a subtle boost with the Waves plugin, is that I'm in order to match the input and output loudness here, I'm only pulling down the output on the API from Waves by 1 dB. In the Logic plugin, I'm pulling it down by 4 dB. If I get rid of this completely and just set it at 0 and 0, watch how much of a difference there is. So when you pull out that volume reduction, you really, really hear more of the boost in the vintage graphic EQ. So the main thing to get out of this is basically that just the vintage graphic EQ, it's still a good model of the 560, but the Waves API-560 is probably more like the original hardware unit. I mean, it's got the API logo on it, so obviously they've gotten permission from API to use their branding on it. Whereas this is essentially like a knockoff of it, a very good knockoff and a very useful plugin, but it's not the same, And I'm not giving this plugin a bad review or anything like that. I really do like it. You just have to be careful about how much you boost things. Something that looks like it's halfway up may actually be more than halfway up in comparison to the original. So just have to be careful with it. Use it sparsely. Don't go crazy with it, because then it's just going to end up with noise and nastiness, and you don't want that in your mix. So while we're wrapping up here, thank you, Jennifer Buckley on YouTube, for suggesting this video topic as a comment in my acoustic foam video. I plan on doing the same with the whole vintage EQ collection in Logic 10.4 and comparing them to other third-party plugins and maybe even some hardware. So congrats, Jennifer. You're also the winner of my Sound Assured acoustic foam giveaway. I'll be reaching out to you shortly to get your mailing address and contact info. All right, guys, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.